Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Men's Chorus. This is the third hour. I've been tempted to just come up here and say the benedictions and go home. The word serenity has more power for me in recent years than it did when I was young, and I thought it brings us to such a place of peacefulness or serenity. Say, wow, I don't know that we can beat that. It's great to see you this morning. This is not bad attendance on this particular day. It is time change Sunday, and it is spring break, so it's kind of a double whammy. The good news is I see some of our college students back, and we're always glad to see you. You know, I love time change Sunday. I look forward to it like a kid looks forward to Christmas because I love the outdoors. It gives me that extra hour. But I had a difficult time starting the day this morning. I'm an early riser, but it's more difficult when you wake up to a broken coffee pot. I did not get my coffee this morning. I have figured out what's wrong with the coffee pot. Well, I fixed it last night. So that's what's wrong with it, right? It doesn't work at all anymore. I worked on it, now it doesn't work at all anymore. I did manage to make it to Starbucks, and I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad that you are here as well. We're in this 3-sermon series on the powerful community. And by that, we're talking about community. It's brought together by God, the power of God-given community, connecting with one another in special and powerful ways, and ways that are different from the ways of the world. And so we're going to read this. It's what I call the chapter 5 solution. We're going to read part of chapter 5 again. Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians. They were anxious about what was taking place around them. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And Paul writes to them, he assures them that we don't know when Jesus is finally coming back, but his response is, but remember the power of community. So we'll start here at verse 9. For God has destined us not for wrath, but for obtaining salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ, who died for us so that whether we are awake or asleep, we may live with him. That's his promise about salvation. And then he says, between now and then, the time that Jesus comes back, therefore encourage one another and build up each other. That's the building of powerful community, as indeed you are doing. But we appeal to you, brothers and sisters, to respect those who labor among you, and have charge of you in the Lord and admonish you. You'll see these positive verbs in here. Respect one another. Here's another one. Esteem them very highly in love because of their work. Be at peace among yourselves. And we urge you, beloved, to admonish the idlers. He's calling for accountability. Encourage the faint-hearted. Help the weak. Be patient with all of them. See that none of you repays evil for evil, but always seek to do good to one another and to all. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. About 15 or 20 years ago, I was quail hunting in West Texas with my good friend Don Wynick. We were on his ranch, which is outside Balmaray, Texas. If you don't know where Balmaray is, if you've never been to Balmaray, it's something that you are missing in your life. It's at the foothills of the Davis Mountains. Some of you know that they measure ranches way out in far west Texas differently from ranches in this part of Texas. If you're in North Texas or Central Texas and you have a 2,000 or 3,000 acre ranch, that's a pretty big ranch. Even in some certain parts of South Texas, that's a big ranch. Out in West Texas, a 2,000 acre pasture is just what they call a horse trap. You know, they just keep their horses there. So we were on his ranch. It is thousands and thousands and thousands of acres. We were in his Jeep and we were driving across of it. This was really in the middle of nowhere. And at one point he stopped high up on a bluff and he said, Don, look down there. Do you see that little shack down there? And it was about half a mile off, and there was a little shack, what had one time been a 1 or 2 room house. It was falling down. And Don said to me, there's a really fascinating story about that. He said about 25 years ago, this man came out here. As I recall, he was from Dallas, and he wanted to buy 1 acre of land from me. And he didn't want it on the road or on the highway. He wanted 1 acre in the most desolate and isolated part of the ranch. And he promised, he said, if you'll sell me 1 acre, then I'll put a deed restriction in it so that when I die, it'll automatically be deeded back to you. And Don said, he offered me really good money, so I said yes. And so I sold him that acre where that house is. He built that little house, and there he lived for over 20 years. He said he had an old Ford pickup truck, and once a week he'd get in that pickup truck. He would drive to town and buy groceries and then come back. But he said other than that, he spent, as far as he knew, he spent every day, 24 hours a day, in the middle of nowhere in that little shack. He never had running water or plumbing or electricity. I don't know how you respond to that story, but I've always been amazed about it, and I think of it often. I think partly because I'm the kind of person that I enjoy my alone time. I grew up with a twin brother, and we always shared rooms when we were young. We shared a bed. I always kind of wanted just to be by myself a little bit, so I can go to my little retreat, my 40-acre ranch, and be up there for a couple of days, not see anybody. It doesn't bother me at all. But when I think about spending years socially isolated, it just blows my mind. And for one thing, we know that people are social animals. David Brooks of the New York Times wrote a book several years ago called The Social Animal, in which he shared all the research over the last 20 or 25 years about our brains and how life works for us. We know that we are social animals, that we are made to commune with one another. So I'm going to say a word or two about loneliness this morning. You may be thinking, now, where are we going to get to the 5th chapter of Thessalonians? We'll get to it here in a minute. But I want to say a word or two about loneliness. We know there's a tremendous amount of research these days that tells us that social isolation leads to early mortality. If you need me to translate that, it's like this: loneliness leads to early death. Research is tricky. It kind of depends on what research you read, but there are research studies out there that say that loneliness is the 2nd or 3rd leading cause of death in America, more so in some studies than heart disease, for instance. We know that the human being was made for social interaction. And yet I suspect that we are in some ways lonelier than ever before in the world in which we've created around us. We have found new ways. We have found new ways to isolate ourselves. I'll give you an example. Last night I took my wife Bobby out to dinner. We oftentimes eat Mexican food on Saturday night. And we were sitting there with the menus in front of us, and we were conversing, looking at the menu, talking, looking at the menu, talking. And I knew something was different. I thought, well, isn't this interesting? How pleasant this is. And then it occurred to me that because I knew I was preaching this sermon this morning, just be prepared, I'm going to talk to you about your phones. Because I was preaching this sermon this morning, I had put my phone in my pocket and muted it before I went into the restaurant, and I had made a commitment to myself that I would not pull out my phone. The pitiful part about that is, as I did that, I recognized that my default behavior, when I sit down at a restaurant and pick up a menu, my default behavior is to pick up my phone. Some of you know I don't do social media. I think when I retire, I might try Facebook. But I don't do it now. It's just a matter of time. Plus the fact that I've always been a little bit anxious about discovering how many friends I don't have. But I don't do social media, but my life is consumed by email. And so I'm constantly on my phone to try to sort through the email, pick it up. And I knew that's what I would have been doing, sitting down, going through my email. As I sat down, our text messages, I text, kind of, not very good at it, with Bobby. And look, isn't it true that that's the way we live our lives? That has almost become the default behavior for a lot of us. Going to a restaurant, going to lunch, I do this all the time. You can look around and people are sitting there looking at their phones rather than talking with one another. You can see a family of 6 or 7. Each kid's got a phone, right? And they're all on their phones. I think it's time that we at least just kind of admit to ourselves that we are creating a kind of social isolation which ultimately can lead to a kind of loneliness in our society because of our addiction to technology. Let me say to you, just say a word about social media. I love social media. Even though I don't do Facebook or Twitter, I love social media, and I'll tell you why. This church can post an event on Facebook and reach within an hour more people than St. Paul reached in a lifetime. Social media, text messaging, email, all of it has made us tons more productive in corporate America and in our churches. I can imagine going back to a time when we didn't have the advantages of smartphones and computers, portable computers, the advantages of technology and social media. And yet, we're being dishonest with ourselves if we don't talk about the potential downsides. We're going to show a movie in the last part of April. It's free. Most places you'll have to go, you'll have to pay to see this movie. It's called Screenagers. It's talking about the impact of technology on our children, especially our teenagers. I've read some of the work of a woman at MIT named Sherry Turkle, who talks about the loss of empathy in our teenagers because of their use of social media. You see, this is what happens when you text or communicate through social media or some other technological way. You can't hear the pain in the person's voice when you've sent them a hurtful or snarky reply. And sometimes maybe you didn't even know it, and you won't know it because of the lack of communication. We don't hear the joy in a text message, or we don't hear the emotional plea or cry for help on the social media message. All of this is leading us to a kind of social isolation and loneliness which is not healthy in America today. Some of you know the name Simon Sinek. This is real odd. For the second Sunday in a row, I'm referencing somebody who's had a huge, one of the most watched TED Talks in the history of TED Talks. And I don't sit around watching TED Talks all the time, but I like to look at the good ones. Simon Sinek's TED Talk on the reason for why is profound. For those of you that in the corporate world, it's really, really insightful and smart. A few months ago, I was watching TV, I guess. I saw a video interview. Maybe it was on my computer, an interview. What else? On my computer, right? I saw an interview with Simon Sinek in which he was talking about the impact of technology on our youth. And this guy's young and with it, you know. But this is what he was saying. He says whether you're in a corporation, a small business, a big business, or a corporation these days, we ought to forbid the taking of smartphones into our meetings. And he said, I've gone around to a lot of companies in America these days, and I've said that, look, ban smartphones from your conference rooms. And everybody says, oh yeah, we do. Once we start the meeting, we turn off our phones, and we make everybody turn off their phone and put it away, put it in their pocket or their purse. And he says, I tell them, that's not good enough. This is going to explain everything, I think. He says, I tell them that's not good enough. Because he says, this is what happens when we take our smartphones to the conference room. People start drifting in one at a time. The first person gets there, they sit down, they get on their phone. The second person comes in, they get on their phone. So 5 minutes before the meeting starts, you can walk in and everybody's on their phone, right? He said, guess what happens when you forbid the carrying of phones into the conference room? This is what happens. The first person goes in and has a seat, Here comes the second person. And the first person looks up and says, Jim, it's great to see you. How's your dad doing? I understand he had a little surgery a couple of weeks ago. How's he doing? And then the third and the fourth person comes in. And Jack over here turns to Judy and says, Judy, I hear you're working on a really big project and you're behind on your project. I've got some extra hours this week. Could I help you? Would you be willing for me to help you on your project? People start connecting and talking with one another in real ways. So look, I completely recognize that I'm at the tiptoe on the border of offending everyone that's here. But this is a question that's worth asking. Do we own our phones, or do our phones own us? Now, Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, what does that have to do with all of this? The Thessalonians had written to Paul, and they were scared. They were afraid. They were living in really anxious times, kind of like the times you and I are living in. They had given their life to Christ with the belief that Christ was coming back. Most of them, I think, believed that Christ was coming back very quickly. And so here they are in the midst of the church, this community they formed, but they're getting anxious and nervous because Christ hasn't come back, and the surrounding community has not necessarily been very affirming of who they were as followers of Christ. They were being persecuted in various ways. And so they wrote to Paul, they said, when is Jesus coming back? And Paul wrote back, and in the first part of this 5th chapter that we did not read, but we read it and talked about it a bit last week, Paul says this. These famous words. We read them a lot of times in the season of Advent. He says, remember that in the eyes of the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. It's reminiscent of Jesus himself saying, we don't know. You won't know the time or the place when I'm coming back. And when he says this, he reminds them of the fact that we don't know, even so we have to live with a certain amount of anxiety, perhaps, about that. He immediately launches into this description of community. He is saying, essentially, that in the middle of the anxiety that you're feeling because we don't know the time or the date, 1,000 years is like a day is like 1,000 years. In the midst of that anxiety, what you have to support you is community. Christian community. And it is extraordinary and exceptional because of the values. I'm going to run through this real quickly. One of the problems that we have in America today is that we have fewer and fewer communities that are held together by values, and more communities that are held together by homogeneity, by everybody having the same beliefs or the same thoughts. Are you following me? And we have fewer communities in general. I talked about Robert Putnam's book a few weeks ago, Bowling Alone. We have just as many people bowling, but more people are bowling alone rather than in leagues. If you grew up in a small town in Texas or Arkansas or Louisiana, I can't speak for other parts, Tennessee, can't speak for other parts of the country, but if you grew up in a small town, you grew up in a little town where there was a bridge club, there was a garden club, there was a Lions club, there was maybe a writing club. And when you go back home these days, you notice that the garden club isn't there anymore. The bridge club is down to 4 ladies. The Lions club, if it still exists, is about half the size. The churches are shrinking and getting smaller. So those are the institutions, the organizations in which we come together because of shared values rather than the same ideology or the same politics or even the same theology. And so Paul writes this letter to the Thessalonians, and we'll dig in deeper next week and we'll talk about these actual values, but let me read them to you again. Esteem very highly and love one another. We urge you to encourage the faint-hearted, to help the weak, to be patient with all. Seek to do good to one another. Rejoice always. Pray without ceasing. Help those who are weak. In all circumstances, give thanks. This is what I call the chapter 5 solution, the chapter 5 of his first letter to the Thessalonians. He doesn't say you have to agree with one another. He doesn't say you're bound together because you have the same theology or you have the same politics or you have the same ideology. He says these are the values: kindness, compassion, patience, forbearance. You're drawn together by the Spirit of Christ. And so for Paul, the church looks like the kingdom of God. It's not everybody sitting at the table and they're all alike. It's not everybody sitting at the table and they all voted the same. It's not everybody gathered around the meal and they have the same ideology or they think the same way about current events. For Paul, the kingdom of God is about the diversity of God's people drawn together in love and mutual support because of their shared values that are rooted in the love of Jesus Christ. It is odd to me that at a time when we need true, powerful community more than ever before, we are becoming lonelier and isolated more than ever before. I just happen to think that this is a 1 Thessalonians 5th chapter moment that the world needs. You and I need the church more than ever before.